I will start the session, first of all, by welcoming all the panelists and all the participants to this session, by thanking the Humanitarian Congress Tokyo for hosting this session, in particular MSF Tokyo, Doctors Without Borders Tokyo office, as well as the ICRC Tokyo office. This session is about the issue of critical minerals, the questions around the supply chain of these critical minerals, and how these, what is in place to manage this supply chain and ensure as much as possible that the critical minerals are not tainted with human rights violations. We will see this is quite a challenge, and we will hear from the various panelists in this regard. I just warned the panelists that as I'm standing it last minute, I don't have under the eyes the curriculum vitae of each of you. So I will ask each of you when it will be your turn to very briefly introduce yourself with just a few sentences, allowing the public to understand who you are and what is your, your role and your perspective in this session. Sorry to be asking you this, but if we go otherwise, I will suddenly have a load of text to read in front of me, and I will not know how to select the most relevant information. So I'm asking for your collaboration in this. Sorry for the inconvenience. So as I mentioned, the point of this session is to discuss critical minerals and the supply chain. We think this is a valid theme for a humanitarian congress because ill-managed supply chains or critical minerals extracted in unfair or in not very well managed conditions are going to create a number of disastrous humanitarian consequences. So we think this links very much with the topic of the session. The objective of this session is not to have a top-end specialized discussion on critical mineral supply chain. We think this session addresses an audience of people who probably have a few ideas but are not top specialists in the management of supply chains. If you are on board and if you are a top specialist in this, then you can leave the session, sorry, because you will probably not find it very interesting. We are not going to enter into the details of the various mechanisms in place, etc., etc. Besides, we have chosen to take the situation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as kind of a background or illustration in order to, not to discuss these issues completely in the air, but to anchor this into some realities. And I don't know for Mrs. Sugawara or Mr. Fernandez, but I know that Mrs. Hanai and Mrs. Veffler are well experienced in working in this context. Now I can see that Sinisha, I can see suddenly Sinisha's face. So Sinisha, I will kindly hand over to you. I was just mentioning what is the purpose of the mission. I was asking the panelists to introduce themselves, but if you wanted to introduce them, then I give you back the floor, and maybe for the point of providing an overview of the issue of critical minerals, conflict minerals. Sinisha, back to you. I'm happy to see you. I have never been so happy to see you.
Me neither. Thank you, Claude, and I apologize. It seems there were some technical difficulties. Maybe it's due to the fact I'm getting old. Who knows? In any case, it's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody attending. My name is Sinisha Milatovic. I am a business and human rights specialist, a global business human rights advisor with UNDP. And it's great to be here. And thank you to the ICRC for inviting us and for organizing this important Congress, as well as this panel. So in brief, I thought that we would just to lay down the ground rules, if you will, I thought I would just frame the topic a bit, and then I would introduce actually each panelist as it's their turn to speak, so that we don't necessarily do that twice. And we hope to have presentations from each panelist, followed by a Q&A, in which I would encourage all of you as participants to join. Feel free to obviously post questions in the chat, and you know, we hope to get to as many as we can during these 90 minutes. So not wasting any more time, as you know, the topic of today is this sort of intersection between critical materials and humanitarian issues and conflict. And I think it's a timely panel because, as all of you know, there is a rising demand for critical materials, 80% of which, according to some lists, are critical minerals like lithium, like cobalt, and others. And this rising demand essentially means that the extraction of these minerals creates three principal categories of risks, if you will. The first being human rights risks, so risk of human rights violations, displacement, labor rights issues, indigenous people's rights, and so on. The second, broadly speaking, is environmental degradation and the violation of the right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment. And we've seen numerous sort of issues and conflicts even sparked by environmental degradation. And the third, which I just hinted at, is conflict itself. So we've seen the demand for generally extractives and now specifically critical minerals drive already, and there are projections that it will increasingly drive conflicts. There are projections of a 5-fold increase in demand for critical materials and critical minerals to drive the sort of green transition over the next 20, 30 years, which will, you know, some foresee correspondingly drive a 5-fold increase in conflicts. And so this link between critical minerals and conflict is obviously, you know, it means that in conflict-affected contexts, we have a heightened risk of both human rights violations and violent conflict. So we have companies being involved in grave human rights abuses. We have companies, you know, causing or contributing to armed conflict and situations of widespread violence, and therefore creating humanitarian sort of crises or helping to create them and having a responsibility for them. So there's been a concerted effort to develop a normative response to address this issue, a sort of a sign that the smart mix that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights possibly have been skewed too far in favor of voluntary measures. And so there's some attempts by some jurisdictions, most notably the European Union, to develop laws, policies to address these issues. First of all, foremost, I would have to say from our end, as far as UNDP, ourselves and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights have developed a guide articulating the responsibilities of companies in conflict-affected areas. This applies to extractive companies as well. So those dealing with critical minerals, it applies to all companies. And it essentially calls on companies to assess and address their negative impacts on conflicts and on human rights. And businesses that fail to meet this responsibility, which is called heightened human rights due diligence, could face serious legal, operational, reputational harm. This guide complements the guide issued by ICRC and DCAF, which I'm sure you'll hear about more during the course of this presentation. And as I mentioned, the European Union itself has taken initiatives to make it mandatory for companies to conduct heightened human rights due diligence. In fact, we see that it is on the brink of adopting something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which includes specific responsibilities for companies in conflict-affected areas, and it recognizes that those companies dealing in high-risk sectors such as extractives have particular responsibilities. At the same time, there are more and more laws and strategies and policies dealing with critical minerals and critical materials. So this model, where you have this rising demand for critical minerals, and at the same time you have this sort of increasing recognition that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights and to not to contribute to conflicts, creates a tension. It has a tension at its core. So on the one hand, you have to meet rising demand for critical minerals. On the other hand, to respect human rights standards and not contribute to conflicts. So these frameworks have numerous implications, which I'm sure we'll hear about more today, for energy companies, for extractive companies, as well as for investors. And we have somebody, our panelist Remy, today to speak a bit about the investor angle. And these implications means that, you know, these companies have to assess and address, they have a responsibility to assess and address any potential or actual negative impacts they have on human rights and conflicts. And at the same time, they face increased legal, reputational, operational risks, and so on. But even more importantly, which I'm sure we'll also hear about from Ms. Hanai as a researcher and Professor Sugawara and so on, they have numerous implications also for affected communities, for peace builders. They provide them with powerful tools to hold energy companies accountable for their impacts on human rights, the environment, and conflicts. They create an opportunity to engage with policymakers, legislators, investors, and companies in developing these regulations going forward. And they create a mechanism as essentially a vehicle for their voices to be heard through the requirement that, you know, of stakeholder engagement. So there is a requirement in all these processes that workers, other communities, and so on are engaged and meaningfully consulted by companies carrying out heightened human rights due diligence and generally operating in conflict-affected areas. So this is where this nexus of critical minerals, humanitarian concerns, human rights, and conflict can be found. And I'm very excited that we have this excellent panel today with us. And our first speaker today, if we can go straight to that, will be Professor Emi Sugawara. She's a professor from the Osaka University of Economics and Law, the Faculty of International Studies. She has an interest in international community movements over business and human rights, as well as cross-border implementation of international human rights standards for companies. She also serves as a board member of Nijiro Diversity, which is an NGO on LGBT rights, the director of Japan Center for Engagement and Remedy on Business and Human Rights, a board member of the Global Compact Network Japan, a member of the Working Group for Promoting the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So as you can see, you're in the best possible hands to kick us off. And I would now ask Professor Sugawara to take the floor. Thank you.
ご紹介いただきましてありがとうございます。大阪経済法科大学の菅原です。本日はよろしくお願いいたします。では、スライドの方共有させていただきます。では、私からは、紛争状況における企業の人権尊重責任というタイトルでお話しさせていただきます。テーマである紛争鉱物より少し広い視点からの話になりますが、よろしくお願いします。ただいまご紹介に預かりました通り、国際人権法の視点からビジネスと人権の問題を研究をしています。本日のテーマである紛争状況における企業の人権尊重責任という問題を、このプレゼンテーションでは主に2つの視点からお話ししたいと思っています。で、この2つの視点の大前提としまして、国連のビジネスと人権の枠組みの中では、2020年にこの紛争状況におけるビジネスの責任ということに関しましてですね、レポートが出されておりますけれども、その中で繰り返し確認をされていますのは、紛争状況においてビジネスは中立的なアクターではないということ、つまりビジネスは紛争とは無関係であるとはもう言えないということですね。これは繰り返し確認をされています。では、それを前提に指導原則、1つ目の視点として、指導原則上の企業の人権尊重責任とはというところ、振り返りも含めて確認をした上で、紛争における企業責任をめぐる、規範形成ですね。どういう形で、規範が形成されているのか、どういうフォーカスで作られてきているのかというのを見ていきたいと思っております。まずですね、一つ目の視点、指導原則上の企業の人権尊重責任ですけれども、ご存知の通り、この指導原則ですね、国連の文書の中で初めてですね、企業の人権尊重責任というものを明確に示したものになります。でただ、しかしながら、この指導原則ではですね、先ほど 新任者さんも触れていらっしゃいましたが、国家の人権保護義務というところを第一の柱とした上で、第二の柱として企業の人権尊重責任、そして第三の柱として、救済へのアクセスというところ、この3つの柱の内容を定めているものになります。でですね、私のプレゼンでぐーっと焦点を当てます。第2の柱、企業の人権尊重責任ですけれども、いくつか特徴がございます。まず1点目の特徴として、企業が尊重すべきは、最低限の基準として国際的な人権基準であるというところですね。私の専門である国際人権法とつながってまいりますけれども、紛争状況では当然のことながら、国際人道法の基準というところも入ってきます。こちらも企業が尊重すべき基準というところで明記をされています。特徴の2点目としては、自社の活動のみならず、関係性、取引関係、バリューチェーン全体がその企業の責任の対象になるというところです。で、3点目の特徴として、このように国際的な人権基準を取引関係全体、バリューチェーン全体で実現をしていくということになると、企業としては何から取り組んでいいのかわからないというふうになってしまうかと思うんですけれども、この指導原則では、このような人権尊重責任を果たすためのマネジメントですね、人権尊重の方針、人権デューデリジェンス、そして是正救済からなる3つのマネジメントのプロセスを示しています。ですね、今回テーマとなります紛争状況ですが、後ほども繰り返し出てきますけれども、紛争状況というのは人権侵害が横行している、人権侵害が非常に起きやすい状況になります。その中でビジネスをするわけですから、当然、普段よりも何段階もハイレベルな注意が必要になってくる。これが強化されたデューデリジェンスという話になってくるというところです。デューデリジェンスも普段よりもより厳格なものが求められるというところです。紛争状況ではですね、まさにその自分たちがビジネスを行っている紛争がどういうふうに起きているのか、自分たちのビジネスがどう関わっていくのか、つながっていってしまうのか、つながりうるのかというようなところの分析が1点目ですね。2点目としては、影響を受けるステークホルダーですね。先ほども出てきましたヒューマン・ライツ・ディフェンダー、人権擁護者はもちろんですけれども、紛争に関わる関係者がどういう人たちがいるのかというところの把握も重要になってまいります。で、3点目としましては、では自分たちの事業ですね、そして製品、サービスが紛争にどのような影響を与えるのか、また与えうるのかというようなところを見ていくということも重要になってまいります。このあたりが非常に強化されたデューデリジェンスとして重要になってくるところです。まさに紛争ですね、コンフリクトセンシティブレンズという言葉が国連のレポートでも出てまいりますけれども、紛争というちゃんとレンズをかけて普段よりも高いものをというところでございます。では次にですね、バリューチェーン全体というところを見てきますと、当然のことながらですね、自社での取引、自社でのビジネス、つまり自社が、例えば紛争地域で展開するビジネスというところで、当然、デューデリジェンスより高いものが求められるということもあるんですけれども、バリューチェーン全体になりますので、自分たちの製品、サービスが作られるまでの流れ、さらには、それのみ、いわゆる上流ですね。このあたりに今日テーマになっております、紛争鉱物が関わってまいりますけれども、加えてですね、自分たちの製品、サービスがどう使われていくかという、いわゆる下流、ダウンストリームの問題というところも、企業責任の範囲に入ってくるというところです。自分たちの製品、サービスがどう紛争と関わってくるかというところも対象になってくるというところです。以上の指導原則上の企業の人権尊重責任を受けましてですね、現在どのような規範形成が広がってきているのかというのを一つ表に表してみました。でですね、
Professor Sugawara,
Yes.
I apologize for interrupting. Just to say that we have 2 more minutes left. We agreed on 10 minutes per presentation. So just for the sake of your presentation, thank you very much.
Alright, thank you very much. では残り2分ということでですね。はい。 規範形成ですけれども、ここでいう規範というのは実際に国内法もしくはEU 指令等の規制になっているものもありますが、国連の方からですね、示されている見解というものも含めてここでは規範と呼んでいます。で、今回ですね、焦点を当てる紛争鉱物に関しましては一番左側にございますが、メーカー、輸入業者にとっては自分たちよりもさらにその原材料を調達する上流の部分ですね、焦点を当てたような規制というものが展開をされてきております。一方、一番下にありますけれども、先ほど CS-DDD の話ありましたけれども、ドイツ、フランスをはじめ、デューデリジェンスそのものを義務化する部分に関しましては、上流から自社の取引関係、自社の活動、さらには下流というところも含めて対象になっております。EU 指令案に関しましては、下流については一部となっておりますけれども、こういった形で規範が作られつつあります。また、国連の見解というところに焦点を当てますと、例えば真ん中ですね、紛争地域からの責任ある撤退についての見解でありますとか、今度は下流ですね、特にテクノロジーの軍事産業に関しましてですね、ガイドライン、見解というのも示されてきているというところで、この、強化されたデューデリジェンスというものが、様々な観点ですね、紛争状況に関わる企業に求められる規範が形成されつつあるというところで、私のプレゼンを終えたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Professor Sugawara. That was an excellent overview and sort of introduction into the frameworks on heightened human rights due diligence and general corporate responsibility when it comes to conflict-affected areas. Our next speaker is Marlene Weffler. I'm sorry if I pronounced your surname correctly, Marlene. She is the principal program manager for the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, or DCAF as it's better known. DCAF, for those that don't know, is an international foundation based in Switzerland, which works on security, human rights, and sustainable development issues, and it's closely partnered with the ICRC. And they produced a groundbreaking toolkit, which resulted in a knowledge hub that I'd encourage all of you to consult, which is a one-stop shop for relevant guidance, documents, tools, and case studies. Before Marlene joined DCAF, she'd worked for various other international organizations and NGOs, and has a wealth of experience when it comes to responsible sourcing of mineral resources, especially from Africa. And she holds an MA in International Humanitarian Law from the renowned Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Marlene, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the organizer of the Humanitarian Congress Tokyo for inviting me on this panel. Thanks, Sinisa, because you rightly introduced DCAF, so I don't need to go through that again. Just wanted to also highlight the fact that I work for the Business and Security Division of DCAF. We heard from the different panelists before me that business are not neutral, and that's why the division was created to work together with business, governments, and communities to improve security and human rights, especially in complex environments. And so the division which I work in works on two different streams that are also complementary. The one stream is to improve oversight and accountability of private security industry. And the other one is to promote initiatives that work and promote responsible business conduct to address security and human rights challenges. Sinisa also mentioned that DCAF is working very closely with the ICRC in relation to the second work stream, and we developed tools and guidance for companies to address security and human rights challenges in complex environments. DCAF is also working hard to operationalize its tools, notably in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in different other contexts. in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We support different project initiatives on the ground. For instance, multi-stakeholder working groups that support dialogue on security and human rights challenges. We carry out also, we support trainings for various security actors, etc., etc. And I'll go back to that a bit later in my presentation. We heard from Professor Sugawara just now the different framework that are that have been set up in relation to hidden human rights due diligence. And so the questions that were, no, it's the next slide. Thank you. The question that I wanted to go back to is, what if there is no human rights due diligence implemented by the companies? What are the possible negative effects of the lack of implementation of this framework? One of the negative effects is for sure the perpetuation of the cycle of violence and human rights violations. And we've seen that notably in the DRC before the adoption of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. There was numerous reports, notably from the UN group of experts, that were saying that in the mining sector, about all the mining sites were either controlled or had interference from armed groups, and that was causing human rights abuses, and that was fueling the conflict in the Eastern Congo. And a second point that I wanted to make was that the effect of the lack of human rights due diligence by companies do not only perpetuate the cycle of violence and human rights violations, but it also keeps the country and the population in a situation of lack of governance and lack of accountability. If we now talk about the example of the DRC Copper Belt, we still have interference of political actors that use security actors to keep the status quo. Numerous violations of human rights have been reported, and that brings us to the situation where the resources do not benefit to the DRC community and the DRC state as a whole, but only to some elites still at the moment. That was quite a negative statement that I was putting, but this is a challenge, but we can see that there are opportunities to improve that. There are important opportunities to improve that through human rights due diligence, but not only. I think it's important to see that we've seen in the last 10 years, since the adoption of the Dodd-Frank Act, since the EU regulation on conflict minerals, and the implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible supply chain, that the situation has changed. The situation has changed notably in the Eastern Congo in relation to 3 Ts, notably, so tin, tantalum, and tungsten. In 2018, there were reports that 80% of the mining sites, the armed groups had left the sites. And so the mining communities could operate without interference from armed groups. So that's quite a positive success in that sense. The negative effect of that is that that those armed groups were not present on one particular minerals, but it was shifting the conflict into other communities, other minerals. And I'm talking more about the gold sector in the Eastern DRC. So my point here is that human rights due diligence should be implemented by the companies, of course, but it should not become a tick-the-box exercise. Otherwise, you have the risk of the conflict shifting to other areas and other minerals. Next slide, please. So what can private company do to change that situation? For companies, I'm thinking of companies based in Japan that do not necessarily have operations in the country, but source minerals. One of the key things that should happen is to know the supply chain. Ask questions, go beyond tier one of your supplier, identify what is the choke point, the smelter or refiner where your produce are coming from, and ask questions to this refiner. What do they have a policy in place? Have they trained their staff? Are they checking the different minerals that are coming? Do they know where they come from? Are they implementing any measures in relation to that? Do they participate in some of the initiatives that have been taking place? In the DRC, there have been some initiatives implemented, notably on the 3T sectors. At the smelter or refiner level, there is the responsible mining assurance program, for instance, that is auditing do smelters. Do they participate in all of that? This is one of the first steps that companies can do. But this is not the only step. Next slide, please. Something that DCAF has been supporting a lot is meaningful engagement and dialogue, because we do believe that multi-stakeholder engagement is key in order for business, civil society organizations, and the government to work together and address issues in a more holistic way. When I was talking about shifting, the conflict shifting from one commodity to another, I think that through better engagement of all the actors on the ground, this could be more prevented. If the governance of the sector, more generally speaking, if we work more closely with the government to address some of the issues, and that could have more impact on the ground. Meaningful engagement.
Yeah. I apologize. Could I ask you to wrap up your presentation in a minute, if possible?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So meaningful engagement can be done at the international level and can be also done on the ground. And maybe I'll go back to that later, but it means dialogue, engagement with key impact areas that are identified by all these different actors. Next slide. That was alluded to a bit earlier by Sinisa in the presentation. DCAF and the RCRC have been working hard to support companies into the implementation of heightened human rights due diligence. One of the first things that we worked on was to ensure that companies have access to information and training and know how to implement good practices. And so we put in place this Security and Human Rights Hub, which is basically a one-stop shop for all tools, guidance, and information that companies can and should be looking at when they are trying to address security and human rights challenges on their supply chain and on their operations. And next slide. And one of the key documents that we develop, and that's been also translated into Japanese, and you can actually access if you scan directly the QR code, hopefully it works, is the toolkit addressing challenges related to security and human rights challenge in complex environments, and so this toolkit builds on concrete challenges faced by businesses in complex environments. It provides concrete examples that companies face, company like you or others, or companies on your supply chain can face when operating on the ground, and it provides key good practices to overcome this challenge. And so it is in relation with the host government, that someone can be very problematic, with private security, public security, and also communities. So I would encourage you to look at this document. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for your great presentation, Marlène. Thank you, especially for highlighting that due diligence should not become a tick-the-box exercise, and for giving practical guidance on identifying choke points and so on. And finally, for highlighting your excellent toolkit. We now go on to our next presenter, and that is Rémi Fernandez. He is the manager on human rights, social issues, and governance issues 4 principles for responsible investment, where he oversees the human rights, social, and governance issues programs, covering issues such as decent work, diversity, equity, and inclusion for responsible political engagement. And during his time at PRI, he has co-authored the Decent Work Through Leadership paper, engaged with signatories on new and former reporting frameworks, and he holds a master's degree in sustainability and social innovation from HEC Paris, as well as a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Sydney. Remy, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sinisa, and also a big thank you to the Tokyo Humanitarian Conference for having me today. Just quickly, in terms of an overview of the PRI. So the PRI is a set of 6 aspirational responsible investment principles, convening over 5,000 signatories, representing $120 trillion of assets under management. And so really being the sort of conveners on responsible investment. So just sort of diving straight in, I think it's important to reinforce that just as for all businesses, investors have a responsibility to respect human rights. And so this responsibility was formalized by the UN and the OECD in 2011. And since then, expectations have only increased. This has really come because the expectations of increasing. This has been through growing visibility and urgency around how human rights issues are sort of evolving, but also a better understanding of the investor's role in shaping real-world outcomes and of their responsibility to do so across all their investment activities. So investors have a 3-part responsibility to respect human rights in line with the United Nations guiding principles. So thanking my speakers beforehand for really giving a thorough overview of what this involves, but just diving into it. So this involves adopting a policy commitment to respect internationally recognized human rights, implementing human rights due diligence processes to identify and prioritize actual and potential negative outcomes for people arising from investees, and ensuring measures are in place for prevention, mitigation, and tracking of ongoing management and communication with clients, beneficiaries, and affected stakeholders. And then finally, enabling access to remedy. We've seen an increasing regulatory convergence around the UNGP's and OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So this is increasing responsibilities both for investors and corporates. So with regards to critical minerals, this includes the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. So this really marks a huge leap forward in sustainable finance policy. So moving away from disclosure-based regulation towards mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And so this means that for companies, it ensures that the law, it ensures that activities are tied to the EU single market are conducted in a responsible manner, and really providing information for investors to really understand and assess what their exposure is to human rights risks. We also have the EU Critical Raw Mineral Materials Act. So this has got the mention of UNDP. However, it could go further, as it doesn't specifically mention free, prior, informed consent, and these and more so just instruments mentioned to minimize socially adverse impacts. We also have the US Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct, and also to highlight and really relevant for this session today, the US and Japan agreement on strengthening critical mineral supply chains, which was signed in March 2023. And this really underlines the importance of ensuring environmentally sustainable supply chains and upholding human rights, specifically labor rights. Next slide, please. So the previous panelists have really sort of gone into a good level of detail around human rights due diligence, and sort of reinforcing that point in terms of understanding and prioritizing human rights related risks across the company's value chain. So it's really important for investors to set expectations in two instances. So for downstream companies, ensuring that they have a responsible sourcing policy or equivalent for minerals that are aligned with OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible supply chain of minerals from conflict-affected high-risk areas, the UNGP's and ILO standards. And so in doing so, they also identify smelters or refiners in their supply chains and assess whether they conduct human rights due diligence, and also ensure that there is traceability and human rights risk assessment, and if supplier relationships reflect the aforementioned international standards. For upstream companies, here it's important to set expectations around tracing back to mining sites. So, and also thinking about what are the circumstances of extraction, trade, and handling of, and the export of the mineral. And so this is thinking of ensuring that smelters and refiners have a chain of custody or traceability system. So using the OECD due diligence guidance, has the company assessed what minerals are sourced from small and artisanal mines? And have they engaged with traders or leveraged suppliers to identify the origin of minerals? And just 2 points I want to raise around how investors can seek to build leverage. So this can be looking at joining investor coalitions, such as the Advance initiative, which I'll speak to in just a little bit, and also thinking about where investors are in terms of their position in the investment chain. So as an asset owner, setting expectations for their investment managers, and also thinking about how do we integrate that into due diligence questionnaires, and then for investment managers, how to engage effectively using the levers that are available. I do want to point to several other organizations working on conflict at present, and we encourage investors to have a look at their resources. So this is the IRIS Foundation, the Heartland Initiative, and of course the UNDP. And just thinking about how the PRI can contribute to positive outcomes. So we've published a suite of resources on how investors can meet their commitments to respect human rights aligned with this three-part responsibility mentioned beforehand. And so what we have is an introduction to human rights for asset owners, human rights risk identification guidance to assist investors in developing their human rights due diligence processes, as well as human rights benchmarks for investors. So this is really important in terms of having a resource around benchmarks to assist investors with risk identification, so they're able to pull information and prioritize which companies to engage with. We've simultaneously developed our policy strategy for human rights and social issues to facilitate an enabling environment for the respect of human rights from corporates and investors. So the report highlights several policy instruments such as corporate ESG disclosure regulation, corporate due diligence regulation, steward frameworks and regulation, sustainable taxonomies, as well as national action plans on business and human rights. And then coming back to the point beforehand, just around our Advance initiative. So our Advance initiative convenes investors to engage with companies in both the mining and metals and renewable energy sector. And it has 3 objectives. So that is the full implementation of the United Nations guiding principles, alignment of company political engagement with their responsibility to respect human rights. So this is really thinking if their lobbying activities are aligned with what their policy states. And then finally, deepening progress on the most severe human rights issues. And so this is what is identified and prioritized through that human rights due diligence process. And that wraps up my section, Sinisa, so I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent and to the point. Thanks very much, Rami. Okay, our final presentation before we launch into a discussion comes from Kazuya Hanai. She is a project assistant professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. She graduated from the University of Tsukuba with a BA in history and a graduate school of education with an MA in education. And after serving as a teacher, she graduated from the Graduate School of Public Policy and earned a PhD at the Graduate School for Frontier Sciences at the University of Tokyo. And before joining the Institute for Future Initiatives, she served as a research associate at the University of Tokyo. And her research focuses very specifically, which is why we're very glad to have her here with her expertise, on the relations between the conflict minerals issues in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the responsibility of Japanese consumers. And she recently published a book called The Justice of Resource Issue, The Responsibility of Consumers on Conflict Minerals Issues in DR Congo. in 2019, she established an MPORITA Congo, and also she works on peace education. So with that being said, Kazuyo, over to you.
Thank you. 皆さんこんばんは。東京大学および NPO 法人リタコンゴの花井です。画面共有をさせていただきます。はい。私はコンゴ民主共和国東部の事例をベースとしまして、サプライチェーンにおける人権デューデリジェンスの課題を、日本の企業の活動というのを中心にしてお話しさせていただきたいと思います。ちょっとマレーさんがお話されたことと被るところもあるかと思いますが、ご容赦ください。はい。コンゴにおける紛争鉱物取引規制というのは、サプライチェーンにおける人権デューデリジェンスが実施された世界最初の事例であるというふうに言えると思います。人権デューデリジェンスが実施されたことそのものはですね、ビジネスと人権の分野で高く評価を受けています。ですが、今後の紛争状況を調査研究している研究者としては、残念ながら成功しているとは認めがたい状況です。その理由は後でお話しします。問題点は大きく2点あると思います。一つは、規制がスポイラーの存在というのを十分に考慮しておらず、紛争と鉱物が結びつくメカニズムを変えられていないこと。第2に、分野を超えた対話協力が十分にできていないためにですね、紛争解決に向かう構造変化を生み出せていないことです。今日は簡単にしかお話しできませんので、詳細に関心がある方は2022年に東大から公開した政策提言を読んでいただければ幸いです。専門外の方にも理解いただけるように、基礎からですね、この問題を解説しています。コンゴでは1996年から2003年まで、コンゴ全土と周辺国を巻き込む大きな紛争が発生しまして、2003年には公式には紛争が終結したというふうにされているんですけれども、実際にはコンゴ東部には120を超える武装勢力というのが今も存在し続けていて、紛争が続いています。地図の中の赤く網掛けした地域が紛争地域です。この地域ではスズ、タングステン、タンタル、金というまとめて 3TG と呼ばれる4種類の鉱物が取れるので、これらの鉱物が紛争の資金源として利用されて、武装勢力と軍による、住民への人権侵害が続いています。なおですね、今後の重要な鉱物資源、輸出品である銅とコバルトが取れるカッパーベルトというのは、紫の網掛けにした地域にありまして、ちょっと紛争が起きている地域とは少し場所が異なっています。菅原先生が説明されたように、2010年にアメリカと OECD で紛争鉱物取引規制というものが制定されまして、サプライチェーンを遡って紛争鉱物が自社のサプライチェーンに紛れ込んでいないかどうかを調査することが企業に求められました。でこの図はですね、先ほどのマレンさんの説明にもありましたが、サプライチェーンの図を示しています。鉱物は図の左の原産地で採掘されて、製錬所にまず運ばれて、そこから数多くの素材加工会社、部品製造会社などを経てですね、主に中国などの工場で組み立てられて最終製品企業に納められます。その過程で何度も国境を越えて輸出されます。ちょっとオレンジで書いたのはその例となるような、例えばこういう国に輸出されますというところです。なので、最終製品企業がアメリカであっても EU 諸国であっても、そのサプライチェーンは世界中に広がっています。なので、日本の国内ではですね、紛争鉱物取引規制にあたる国内法というのが存在しなくても、3TG を原料に使う日本企業は調査を実施しないと製品の輸出ができないというような状態になっているわけです。でこのグローバルな規模の規制に対応するためにですね、サプライチェーンの上流と中流と下流に様々なプログラムが作られて、鉱山から最終製品になるまで紛争に関わらない鉱物がクローズドパイプラインで取引されるというように仕組みが整えられました。で今後の鉱山地域で操業する企業がない日本でも、JETA というですね、業界団体が責任ある鉱物調達検討会というのを設置して、数百社の加盟企業が調査をスムーズに協力して実施できるように温度をとっています。私は日本の企業38社にインタビューをして、JETA の会合にもよく呼んでもらって、情報共有と意見交換をしていますが、JETA の紛争鉱物に関するオンライン説明会には、1000人を超える企業の担当者が集まって、毎年ですね、1年に1回開かれるんですが、毎年熱心に 勉強をしています。で、それではこういうふうに規制が作られたことによって、仕組み作りができたことによって、今後東部の紛争が解決に向かっているかというと、先ほどからお話がありますように、残念ながらそうではありません。こちらは今後で発生した紛争関連イベント、つまり武力衝突ですとか、暴動ですとか、市民の暴力の数と死者数を表したグラフです。赤とオレンジと黄色で塗ってあるところが、これ地域別になっていまして、赤とオレンジと黄色になっているところが、先ほどの地図で赤く網掛けした地域を表しています。これを見るとですね、2010年に規制が導入された後に、むしろ紛争が悪化していっているということがよくわかると思います。で、なぜじゃあ規制が紛争解決に貢献できないかというのを、私はすごくずっと関心を持ってそれを調査してきたわけですけれども、そこでですね、私が指摘したい問題点が2点あります。一つがですね、スポイラー問題です。スポイラーっていうのは、紛争解決とか平和、合意、和平合意ですとか、あるいは平和構築への取り組みを台無しにしようとする、主に内部のものを指します。紛争解決プロセスには必ずつきものだというふうに言っていいと思います。今後の紛争鉱物問題の場合、サプライチェーンの下流企業が頑張って調査をしたり、仕組み作りをしても、上流の鉱物産出地域にスポイラーがたくさん存在して、鉱物のロンダリングに従事しています。2022年には NGO グローバルウィットネスが詳細な報告を出しまして、いかに紛争不利鉱物を認証する仕組みそのものが紛争鉱物のロンダリングに利用されているかということを示しました。今日は事例の詳細にはちょっとあまり踏み込まないようにということなので、詳細割愛しますが、ここで強調したいのは、スポイラーは武装勢力だけではなくて、今後政府の中とか、あるいは周辺国にもいるということです。こうした状況を見ますと、今後が抱える問題が紛争鉱物をめぐる経済問題だけではないということがよくわかると思います。汚職と腐敗などの政治問題、感染症の蔓延を含む社会問題、周辺国や国連の介入問題を含む国際問題など、多くの問題が絡み合ったところで紛争が起きています。なので、紛争鉱物問題を切り口としながらも、今後が抱える問題の全体像をよく見て、一つ一つの問題に取り組んでいる必要があります。おそらくこうした問題の構造というのは別に今後だけではなくて、他の地域や他の紛争地域や他の国、あるいは鉱物問題が起きている国では同じように起きているのではないかと思います。2つ目の問題は、私から研究者の立場から見させていただくと、分野を超えた対話協力というのはあまりできていないのではないかというふうに見えてしまいます。サプライチェーンの上流で問題解決に取り組んでいる人道援助機関の皆さんと、下流で規制に対応している企業の間には大きな断絶があって、お互いに何をしているのかをあまり知らないような状態になっているように見えます。私が対象としての日本企業がメインですが、そのような状態に見えてしまいます。日本企業にインタビューをするとですね、自分たちはこんなに一生懸命に規制に対応しているのに、紛争が終わらないんだとすると、それは上流の問題なのではないかっていうふうに疑念を抱く声も聞かれます。そのような状態なので、マルチステークホルダーアプローチというのが唱えられていても、実際には特定のアクターしか働いていなかったり、お互いにお互いの責任を追及したりとかするような状態が残念ながら起きてしまっているというふうに見えます。また政治アクターにとって、紛争鉱物問題の優先順位が必ずしも高くないのではないかということを常々感じています。ドナー国の政府ですとか、政府援助機関にとっては、コバルトや銅などの重要鉱物の確保ですとか、あるいは森林保護、今後の豊富な熱帯雨林を保護することによって、CO2 排出権取引の権利を得ることの方が重要であったりとかするためにですね、紛争鉱物問題とか鉱山での人権問題が起きているということが分かっているのに、それに目をつぶって、その今後政府との取引ですとか、援助というようなことをやっているのではないかというふうに感じることがしばしばあります。だからこそ、企業ですとか、人道援助機関が政治アクターにも働きかけて、紛争解決への構造変化を生み出していくことが必要なのではないかというふうに思います。はい。で、私の発表は以上です。もし詳細にご関心があれば、こちらの QR コードから政策提言を読んでいただければ幸いです。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Kazuya. That was an excellent presentation, and it's great for all of us to become more familiar with the situation in DRC and the impact that conflict minerals and critical minerals are having there. I would now ask all of you to submit questions in in the chat. I would encourage all of you to come forward. We've heard excellent presentations from our panelists. In the meantime, until we do, I'll feel sort of free to ask away myself, if that's okay. And let me first come back to Professor Sugawara, who talked a bit about the sort of international framework and so on as it applies. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what gaps do you see when it comes to sort of the international guidelines and frameworks and regulating abuses related to critical minerals? Do you think there should be something more specific, regulations more specific, something more detailed, or is the current framework fine as is? And I'd ask everyone just to keep their sort of answers short and sweet so we can get as much discussion going as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question. And the effectiveness of regulation, international guideline, or etc., is examined through 3 stages, I think. The firstly, whether the regulation, guideline, etc., is being complied with. The secondly, whether there are changes in corporate behavior. And finally, whether unwanted outcomes. Here, we discuss the mineral and political mineral issues are being prevented. The compliance is important, but what is even more crucial is how corporate behavior can be transformed. Besides following the guidelines, it's important to focus on, I think, capacity building. To ask business partner for disclosure of information regarding mineral is one approach. However, we cannot just demand disclosure from company like a SME or micro enterprises that don't know how to address the issues. If there's a black box somewhere in the value chain, it's unlikely to lead to solving the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if the other participants don't mind, I was obviously hoping to keep this as interactive as possible. So something you said made me think to turn to Remy, actually, and because you mentioned, capacity building and the sort of knowledge of companies is crucial and so on. From an investor's point or the PRI's point of view, but obviously working with investors, where do you think we're at when it comes to this sort of capacity, knowledge, and so on? And if I could ask you to obviously feel free to answer expansively, but I would just be curious, sort of on a 1 to 10 scale, how do you think the companies that your investors work with stand when it comes to their knowledge on these issues?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I could quite put it on the scale, and I think that's actually it's quite across the scale in terms of what investors are aware of in terms of how companies are performing and how they're going about human rights due diligence. And I think this goes back to that point around the crucial part of bringing investors together to convene, both to sort of combine their sort of AUM holding and engagement on a company, but also to inform each other. So if you have, say, for instance, a company, an investor with a smaller holding but has an excellent on-the-ground knowledge, pairing them up with an investor that has a larger holding in that company can inform the investor with the larger holding on that engagement there. And so that's sort of how that capacity building can happen between investors. Secondly, it would be around also bringing together, connecting investors with affected stakeholders and their representatives. So where you have a company providing information, connecting an investor to, say, a trade union to sort of ask, how accurate is this information? What's happening on the ground, or with community groups? So I think that's how you can connect the dots to really sort of enrich due diligence efforts and bring that knowledge together.
Can I follow up with something that you just mentioned, which is information? What kind of information is available to investors, and what is lacking when it, especially I can imagine that, finding out with accuracy what goes on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, unless you talk to Ms. Hanai, would be fairly difficult. So what sort of information is available? What is lacking?
So where there is information, it largely comes from voluntary disclosure frameworks. And so there is information available, but it is more so sort of a patchwork of disclosure. So what's missing is that sort of consistency and also information from across a wide range of companies. And so that's where CSDDD is really important in sort of standardizing that playing field to ensure that the information is consistent and timely.
That's my impression from the sidelines as well. We have a question in the chat, so this sort of piggybacks off the question that I posed to Professor Sugawara initially, which is for Kazuya, which is on regulations. I feel sort of silly translating it from Japanese to English and then back to Japanese. I don't know if, but essentially it's to do with the effectiveness of regulations and what should be done. If you can see the question in the chat. Because what essentially should be done to ensure that regulations, why were the regulations passed while leaving problems such as not including spoilers and a lack of cross-sectoral cooperation? Were these problems not anticipated when the regulations were created? And the second question is, what is needed to overcome these problems and introduce truly effective regulations? This is a question from Shiori Tagawa. Kazuya, over to you.
Yeah, can I answer in Japanese? Okay.
Of course, of
Oh,
course.
okay, okay. はい。ご質問ありがとうございます。ちょっと、どうしてこのような規制ができたのかという経緯を説明すると、また長くなってしまうのもあるんですけれども、やっぱりですね、割とちょっと人道援助機関の、欧米の場合、人道援助機関がこういった問題を放置してはいけないというふうに、アメリカですとか EU のですね、政府をきちんとプッシュしたということが大きな力になって規制ができたと思います。ただ、規制ができるにあたっては、とてもですね、議会の中で反対とかがたくさん起きていましたので、実は、ドットフランク法というのは1502条に、今回の紛争鉱物取引規制が入っていますが、1502条というように、たくさんの規制が入れられた一つのパッケージの、いわゆるクリスマスツリー方式といっていろんなものを入れて、パッとこう通したという法案でした。なので、その中に、紛争鉱物取引規制もスッと入れることができたという意味で、そこにこう機運があったということはすごく、高く評価できるんですけども、十分に議論をして、十分に仕組み作りのことを検討して、規制がスタートしたというふうにはならなかったというのが、流れだと思います。本当に効果のある規制を導入するためにはですね、やっぱり今回規制が導入できたということは評価できると思うので、これを、ちゃんと規制を守るっていうか、その通りに実現するために必要な要素として、どこに問題があるのかを同定して、その問題を取り除く作業というのをしていくことが、やっぱり必要なんだと思うんです。なので私は、この規制はですね、今サプライチェーンの上流の鉱物の産出地域に穴が開いていると、クローズパイプラインに穴が開いているということがこの10年で分かったので、ここをきちんとターゲットして問題解決に向かうということが必要なんだと思っています。
Thank you very much. We have quite a few more questions to get to, so I'll sort of defer mine. We have one, and I think it's best if I address it to Marlene, actually, on due diligence processes in armed conflict settings. You can see it yourself, I think, but especially concerning the relationship between the government and armed groups or corporations. How involves, it says how involves, I guess, how to adapt to address complex and high-risk environments of conflict zones, and who should take a lead to ensure compliance with IHL and human rights laws. Marlene, I hope that question is clear to you. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. And perhaps also I wanted to just quickly come back to the question before, if I may, because of my previous work in the field. I don't think the question was a lack of engagement with the different stakeholders when those legislation and the regulations were formed. I think there was a high engagement, talking more about the OECD guidance on responsible mineral supply chain. There was engagement with the ground, with different industries, with civil society organizations. So I don't think the problem is the regulation. The initiative initiative that has been put in place after also take into account the supply chain. So who were involved in trying as much as they could not to leave out the actors that were actually involved, because that would increase the possibility of having spoilers, but to include them like that. And so I think the problem is more into the fact that this legislation cannot solve all the issues in the DRC. There is a necessity to think about it more holistically, include other type of initiatives in that sense, but you will always have spoilers. I think that those initiatives helped a lot tremendously to bring more transparency to the sector and enabling other organizations to take on some of the issues that are faced. One of the issues, and that brings to the second question, is the relationship with the armed group companies, armed group. How is the duration or lack of how does it fuel conflict, finance conflict, etc., etc. Through due diligence, it's been what is required for company is to cut the link in between conflict financing and human rights violations. This being so the goal is really to cut this link, but remaining as much as possible engaged with the supplier to manage those different risks. The toolkit, for instance, talk a little bit about engagement with public security actors and engagement in those complex environment. I think the key is to keep on the discussion with the host government, is to plan as much as possible what could go wrong in relation to that, understand the dynamic of the conflict, making sure that you have necessary information in relation to make the right decision at the right time, and work as much as possible in a way that is as joining the dot in between initiative and in between actors as possible. And that's where I think those multi-stakeholder working group come into hand, because it brings together all different actors that are involved in the ground in order to assess the different risks on a ongoing level and respond to this risk as it goes. Recently, there was this M23 coming even more in the north of Kivu, and I think that this led to one of the initiatives to suspend its activities for some time in order to not finance the activities of M23. So I think through direct engagement with all the different actors, you can have a much more impact on the ground.
Thanks very much, Marlene. I see a question for Professor Sugawara from my colleague Akiko, which is, what is needed to promote human rights due diligence by Japanese companies in this area? So in addition to sort of capacity building, what else is needed, whether from them, I assume, or from the likes of government or anybody else, civil society, and so on. Over to you, Professor Sugawara.
ご質問ありがとうございました。日本語で回答させていただきます。でですね、紛争鉱物をはじめとして、この紛争状況の分野において日本企業のデューディリジェンスを促進するために何が必要かということで、先ほどからお話あった通り、企業だけでこの問題到底解決できるものではないのですので、やっぱり政府の義務であったりっていう大きな枠組みの中で考えていくっていうのはもちろん大事なんですけれども、ぐっと企業にフォーカスを当てたときに、ちょっと2点思うことがございます。まず1点目は、先ほど花井先生からありました通り、この紛争鉱物の取り組みということが、非常に高く評価されてきたというお話がありました。で、高く評価されるがゆえに、非常にこの紛争鉱物に引っ張られるような形で、日本のデューデリジェンスの取り組みが形作られてきたというところは、良いところでもあり、悪いところも、というか残念なところもあると。 で、残念なところの代表格は何かというと、取引先に情報を出してもらう取り組み、要は取引先に悪いことがないかどうかをチェックする仕組みというような形になってしまっているということです。指導原則が言う人権デューデリジェンスというのは基本的に自分たちの企業活動が人権に負の影響を及ぼしてないかどうかということが重要になってくりますので、その点ですね、非常にちょっと気になっている点です。そのことがですね、先ほど、花井先生からも、マーレーンさんからもあったような、対話とかアクター同士の協力の断絶というようなところですね。取引先に情報を聞けばいいという問題ではなくて、やっぱり人権の問題なんだというようなところが、やはり原点として変えるべきという、原点として振り返るというのは、促進していくために、まず一歩大事なことだと思います。で、2点目として、そうなっていきますと、やっぱりどうやってこの問題に取り組んでいったらいいのかというところが重要になってきますので、やはり能力構築っていうのは大事になってくると思います。ただ、なんでしょう、能力構築も、今年ですね、国連のビジネスと人権、昨年だ、ビジネスと人権作業部会が出したレポートにして、2段階からなってました。1段階目はガイドラインだったり、ある種一方的な情報発信等なんですけども、やっぱり2段階目としてどう実際に取り組んだらいいのかというような、双方向ですね、企業からの、ニーズであったりに応えながら双方向での能力構築をしていく、いわゆるヘルプデスク型の取り組みっていうのが大事になってくるのかな。まさに紛争レンズをかけて取り組むっていうのはどういうことなのかということを、ガイドラインはすごく大事なんですけれども、そのガイドラインの先に企業が実際取り組み際での悩みだったり、実際どうしたらいいのかっていうところに答えていくような能力構築っていうのが必要になってくるのか。そういう点でUNDP さんの取り組みっていうのは非常にね、企業さんとの対話もベースにされてて非常に大事だなというふうに私自身は考えております。菅原香は以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Professor. Actually, could I ask Dr. Hanai to sort of offer her reflections on this and then to tackle a related question which came in on the chat, which is for those that have not looked at the chat, which is when we engage companies, some of them are not yet fully aware of the issue, but we sometimes receive responses that there is no problem because they are buying from Responsible Mineral Initiative certified refineries. So from the initiative called RMI. So what would you recommend that we ask more of these conscious companies? And I guess linked to that is the previous question to Professor Sugawara on what more is needed, so more broadly from Japanese companies and for Japanese companies and so on. Over to you.
はい、ありがとうございます。まさに私が問題意識を持っているところに、ご質問いただきましてありがとうございます。やっぱり、もう菅原先生のまさにおっしゃる通りで、日本の企業はですね、目の前にある自分たちが規制としてやらなければいけないことに応えることにすごく必死になっているというふうに思います。もし、参加者の皆さんも関心があればですね、JEITA の責任ある鉱物調達検討会というので、検索していただくと、彼らがやっている説明会でですね、どのようなプレゼンの資料が使われているかっていうのを見ることができるんですけども、非常にですね、繊細に緻密にいろんなことを意識していますが、とにかくやっぱり規制に応えるということ、EU がどこまで規制をかけてくるかということがですね、2021年に EU 規制の詳細がわかるまで、企業は戦々恐々としていまして、なので、どうやったら答えられるんだろうか、先んじて、どういう準備をしておいたら、規制に引っかかって輸出ができなくなるなんていうことが起きないで済むかっていうことに、すごく救急として準備をしていたんですね。なので、やっぱり日本の企業は基本的に真面目だということを、前提にしていただきたくてですね、日本の方が今日多いと思うんですけれども、参加者には、基本的にやっぱり日本企業は規制とか調査とか求められたら、それをもう一生懸命完遂しようとしてやるんですね。で、それによってその目の前のことに一生懸命になってしまって、それが最終的に何のためなのかっていうことが、ちょっと見落としてしまうという傾向はあると思います。だからこそ、JEITA の の方々は私をですね、その紛争鉱物の講習会に呼んでくださって、あるいは大手の大きなですね、有名な日本の企業もですね、私を講習会に呼んでくださって、今後で何が起きているのか、みんなに話をしてほしい。何のために私たちが調査をしているのか、それをみんなに話してほしいというふうに依頼してくださったわけです。なので、デニムクエゲイ氏という方がいまして、これの前のセッションで、紛争下の性暴力の話がありましたけれども、今後の紛争下の性暴力に取り組んでいるデニムクエゲイ氏の映画を、このジェイタの説明会で企業対象に上映会をしたりとかして、一生懸命ですね、この調査が何のためにやっているのかっていうのを、みんなに知らせようと頑張っている取り組みもあります。ただ、本当に今質問にいただいたようにですね、そうは言っても結局 RMI の認証を受けた製錬所から購入しているんだから問題ないっていうふうに、してしまう向きも、多いと思います。私は日本の製錬所に直接聞いたことがあります。RMI の仕組みの中で製錬所が実際にはロンダリングに使われていると。証明書が発行されているけれども、この証明書を発行している製錬所がロンダリングをしているという情報がありますが、そういう情報を聞いたらあなたたちはどう思いますかっていうふうに聞いたら、それに関しては、その情報を私たちが真に受け止めたらビジネスができなくなるので、私たちは仕組みを信じるしかないんですっていう回答を得たことがあります。なので、そこにですね、先ほど上流と下流の間でギャップがあるっていう話をしたんですけども、だから、この紛争を解決するためにやろうって思っている人たちもいますけれども、そこまではできない。自分の目の前にある責務を果たすのがいっぱいだっていう企業もたくさんあるのは事実で、そこに力を割いていたら、それこそですね、小さいような部品の会社とかも自社が潰れてしまうというぐらいの精一杯の中で調査をしているところもありますので、やっぱりそこは、ただただやりなさい、求めなさい、今後のことも考えなさいというふうに言うだけではなくて、サプライチェーン全体の中で、この企業がやっていることをもっと効果的にするためには、誰をプッシュするべきなのか、誰にどう動いてもらうべきなのかっていうことを、やっぱり次のステップとして考えるべきでは、ちゃんと言っていくべきではないかなというふうに思っています。以上です。
Thank you very much. I'm hoping to squeeze in at least 2 more questions. One is directly here in the chat for Marlene, and it seems that, unsurprisingly, a lot of the participants would like practical guidance and examples of best practices and so on. So the question is, what can companies do on site rather than just ticking boxes? And we understand that not all companies investing in joint ventures in the mining sector want to participate in human rights due diligence or in the Mitsui Sumitomo insurance platform. I think somebody would have to clarify possibly what that is, or the Marlene, you might be familiar. Please let me know if you have any good experiences. So over to you, Marlene, if you can share any positive experiences from the field. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And thanks a lot for the question. The tick the box exercise is exactly what we saw in the chat with someone saying like they're participating in RMI. It's all fine. It's all good. We're okay. This is not all fine. It's not all good. We're not okay. It's a good step. But then one of the questions that you can ask is like, how did they use the information that is provided? What can they do then when they identify those risks? What are the actions that companies take on the ground to mitigate that? And this is one thing that as an actor in Japan, you can already take. I think it was Remy who mentioned that there needs to be a trigger, there needs to be pressure also being done by companies to trickle down the supply chain and make sure that there are actions that are being told. So one, ask the difficult questions and be ready to have difficult answers. Second one, I think make sure that you you collaborate as well with other different initiatives so that you can understand the issue as a whole and not just with the length of human rights due diligence. We, DCAF and ICRC, are specialized in security and human rights. This is one lens. DCAF is working as a whole in working on security sector reform. This is another lens that you should be taking. I've seen also companies based in Japan using the information and the transparency of those information to directly contribute to initiatives on the ground. So one of the issues being conflict, human rights violations, and so, but they can intervene and fund or jointly fund through different type of initiative actions on different topic, like gender being one or others. So this is one thing one action that you can take. Second one is to ask your suppliers to participate in those forums and meaningfully participate in this forum, not just send one of their company staff to be represented, but ask what actions they are really taking when they discuss risk in relation to a particular problem. Yeah, I don't know if I responded to the question in a whole or.
I think so. That was excellent. I now have, I'll take the unusual step of asking our closing speaker, who is also our opening speaker, to ask a question to one of our panelists. So this is a man of many talents. He's the Leonardo da Vinci of conflict minerals. Claude, I understand you have a question for Rémi, so over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, a very short question, Rémi. We all sense and we all know that investors are a crucial part in this puzzle to improve human rights of communities, the rights of communities, etc., etc. And I would be very curious just to have your high-level assessment. Do you think investors are doing enough at this stage? And if not, where are the choke points in, preventing them to do more and to really be more demanding on companies? This is not going to go if you don't do this.
That's a really good question. I think it goes down to, do they have the tools to be doing enough, or do they have the resourcing to be able to engage effectively? So when you're in a company engagement meeting or where you're sort of resourcing your stewardship efforts, is it enough to be able to adequately and sufficiently tackle these issues in a meaningful way? And also thinking what tools in terms of data is available to you to be able to make that assessment of how to prioritize companies. So I think there's a willingness, but there's also challenges in terms of resourcing and data. And I think because, and just reflecting on these points earlier in the panel, because investors are becoming increasingly aware of this, particularly through renewable energy, there's a lot more attention and being placed on, right, we need to be able to do this effectively. We should be resourcing our stewardship teams to sort of tackle these issues. So hopefully that sort of answers that question in terms of, willingness, but where are the tools?
Could I just quickly follow up? Are there any efforts made to engage data providers, ESG data providers, to sort of provide more comprehensive data, or other stakeholders like civil society groups? Or I saw something called, now I'm forgetting the exact name, but it was something like Wiki Invest, or it could be the other way around. I forget the name. But basically trying to crowdsource essentially the information available out there about conflict-affected areas and high-risk areas and so on. I mean, what if any efforts are bearing fruit for now with investors when it comes to providing good data on critical minerals, on conflict-affected areas, and so on?
That's a good question, and I think there is an opportunity now to engage with service providers, and being the the clients of service providers, it's really important to ask questions around what is your methodology? How are you arriving at this set of data, and particularly thinking about controversy-based data versus proactive sort of approaches to getting data. So I think it's a question for investors to answer sort of independently, but also think about bringing other investors together to think about how to collectively engage with service providers, and just also a plug for our collaboration platform with the PRI, which serves as a platform to sort of disseminate on engagements at a regional level, but also globally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sinisha.
No, I was going to hand it to you just to thank all the panelists. Thank you all very much. We have another 5 minutes left, so for our closing remarks, over to Claude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, indeed, all the panelists. Yes, some closing remarks. And to start my closing remarks, I would like to rebound on one of the latest comments made by Marlene. Marlene, you were saying that you should be ready to ask difficult questions to companies should be ready to ask difficult questions and be ready for difficult responses. And maybe this is where the nut of the problem is, because we know that companies like simple questions and simple response that provide a yes or no path in front of them. And this is what often is not possible, and in particular when you operate in a conflict-affected area. So yes, implementation of human rights due diligence is very difficult and challenging, as we have been seeing and hearing over the past hour and a half. And this is even more so for businesses when they operate in conflict-affected or other high-risk environments. And again, should it be Mrs. Hanai or Marlene's presentation made this quite clear. And we should remember that this is not only the case for the DRC. DRC was used as an example, but you can replicate this type of difficulties when you think of contexts like Myanmar, which I know is an important operating place for Japanese companies, the Philippines, many corners of South America, many corners in Africa, and even Europe, if you look at what's happening between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We have seen that some of the solutions that have been found, should it be regulations or other initiatives, are addressing parts of the problems in the operating environment, possibly bringing at times local and specific improvements. But at the same time, we have seen sometimes these same solutions can leave other parts of the problems in the operating environment unresolved, and thus contribute to perpetuating or even worsening the original problem at times. I think we have had several times the notion that businesses operating in conflict-affected areas are not and cannot pretend to be neutral. I underline this point because I think this is massively important. We've heard this from Mrs. Sugawara and from Marlene also, I think. Another point is we have also seen and heard either directly or indirectly at times that many, if not most, companies adopt processes that are focusing primarily on compliance. And this is definitely a first good step. You have to do this, but compliance is not proper human rights due diligence or heightened human rights due diligence. When you are carrying out human rights due diligence that serves, compliance approach serves primarily the company's interest. This is very inward looking, what I should do to be safe and to be quiet. True and genuine human rights due diligence or heightened human rights due diligence is outward looking and is open to these difficult questions and the difficult responses and finding a path through this. So I think this is a very important point that we have to remember. Business may argue that this is complicated and these are systemic problems that have a cost and maybe go beyond their capacity. This is partly true. This is not completely true. And we see that business is very much able to go beyond what is their normal field of work when they have to defend trade interest or economic interest. And we see that they are a bit failing to do this in most circumstances when it concerns human rights. So there is a path for improvement there. We have seen there are many good tools, and they have been mentioned during this presentation, and I refer the participant to these tools. Now, to conclude, some words of thanks again to the organizers of the Humanitarian Congress Tokyo, Doctors Without Border, and the ICRC. To all of you panelists for your insightful presentations. Thank you very much, all of you. Sinisha for accepting to moderate the session. Thank you, Sinisha. UNDP, beyond Sinisha, UNDP for providing backup support in the preparation of this session with advice and contacts. Thank you very much. This was very helpful. And to all of you participants for your attendance, for your questions, for your comments. This was lively. Thank you very much. I think we are all open to continue the conversation offline. It will be easy for participants to find our contacts if you have follow-up questions or issues you want to continue addressing. So please don't hesitate and go forward. So I close here. I don't know if there is anybody else who comes or to formally close. If not, let's consider we finished. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists, and see you soon.